Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to all of you to the first of this Middle East doubleheader at Rusi today, the first of two events, the first on Syria, the second on Saudi Arabia, which will be following shortly after, and I know some of you will be attending both of those. It is quite a strange time to be talking about Syria in a time in London where we have a prince from Saudi Arabia talking about the future, and yet this event will start by talking a little bit about the past and actually the one conflict in the Middle East which has defined most people's careers, perceptions of the region for 7 years now. And it is incredible that when I actually think back on my career and the time I've known both Ziya and Hassan Hassan, that I cannot remember a time in which either of us or any of us were not talking about the conflict in Syria, not talking about its impacts across the region, be they social, political, strategic, or in terms of security. And of course, as the conflict has dragged on into this seventh, even more bloody year, and I can't believe it's possible to say that this year has actually been more bloody than the previous year, the security implications for the United Kingdom, for regional states, are more acute than perhaps they've ever been. And one of the goals of today will be to have a look inside Syria from the perspective of a Syrian who has spent most of his life following the changes and the traumas in his country, and that, of course, of Ziya, who will look at perhaps the most interesting and new dynamic in the Syrian war, which is the entrance of Turkey into the conflict against the Kurdish YPG, and assessing that from a strategic perspective. So I'm going to stop talking because I think these two men have plenty of things to say, and I think you will find their insights particularly enlightening. Hassan Hassan, of course, many of you will know, is one of the famed authors along with Michael, what was his surname now? Michael Weiss on ISIS, and one of the first people to release an extended piece of literature about ISIS, reflecting some of the changes he saw in his hometown. He is now a senior research fellow at the Tahrir Institute in Washington, D.C. Ziya Meralwill, a longtime friend of the Institute, is now a researcher with the British Army at their Center for Social Conflict and Strategic Analysis. And he will be speaking second. May I just remind you all, please, we do have the AV system on today, so could you please turn your phones to silent? The comments made by the two gentlemen will be on the record. The Q&A session, which I hope will be a very frank and fruitful one, will be off the record. So anything that Hassan and Ziya say during the Q&A session cannot be transmitted outside or attributed to them in any way. So without further ado, I would like to welcome you both, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. And Hassan, would you like to kick us off?
All right. Oh, I should speak from there. Thank you, Michael, for the invitation. So I was expecting actually a conversation, so I'm going to keep it short, but I'll give a framework of how I see the situation today, very quick, hopefully, because sometimes it drags on. So basically, the situation today in Syria, the way I see it, and I think something I've been advocating at observers and policymakers to see it that way, is as quadrants. It's basically 4 areas in Syria, and I say that because for many reasons. First, because kind of maybe just lay out what I mean by that. Basically, Syria today is divided into 4 areas. There's the areas that have been taken by from ISIS, so the eastern side of Syria, and northern Syria, which is mostly areas that are where Turkey operates, and where Syrian rebels still have centers in northwestern Syria. And then obviously the places currently controlled by the Syrian government, and the other area, which is southwestern Syria, which is an area that is also that has rebel presence, and where Israel seems to be most interested in. So you have the 4 areas, 4 different foreign powers interested in it: the U.S. in eastern Syria, Turkey in the north, Russia and Iran in western Syria mostly, and Israel in the southwest. And that's both an opportunity and a problem, because obviously it's an opportunity, because this is many of the things that observers and people who watch the Syrian conflict pushed for is now a reality. So de facto safe zones exist throughout Syria. The American intervention in Syria, something that the Obama administration resisted for a long time, is now a reality. The United States and the coalition of 75 countries have a sphere of influence. Well, it's really American sphere of influence in eastern Syria. That's 1/3 of Syria, the size of West Virginia in the U.S. I don't know what is in British standards, like London.
Wales, maybe.
Wales. So I say that's an opportunity. Why? Because it's easier now for foreign powers to talk, and this is what Ziya probably we're going to be talking about, how Turkey and Russia have been talking and have been redrawing the Syrian map in much of Syria, and especially in the north and the northwest. And you have other countries that can talk about certain things. So you have a conversation between Russia and Israel, for example, about who is who and where Iran operates in southwestern Syria. That's an easier conversation to have than if you have to talk to Syrian rebels, ragtag militias with different agendas, fighting each other or fighting against the Assad regime. In western Syria, eastern Syria especially, this is my area, my hometown there. I see multiple, a multitude of opportunities, especially now in the current stage that I call the afterglow, after the defeat of ISIS, after the Americans have carved out 1/3 of Syria. Basically, this will be up to the international community and what they want to what they decide to do in that area, and how they want to basically keep ISIS, or try to keep ISIS dead in that region. Are they going to basically exploit the current situation, take advantage of the fact that ISIS is out? Not only ISIS, but also Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda used to operate in eastern Syria. It was once it was the strongest center for them in eastern Syria, in Deir ez-Zor, in my hometown. Now Al-Qaeda doesn't exist in 1/3 of Syria. ISIS also doesn't exist in a meaningful way also in 1/3 of Syria. So the question would be, having taken this decision to intervene in Syria, to start a mission in Syria, how are you going to end it? How are you going to conduct it along the way, and also how you end it? I think that's a question that has to frame the conversation, because you hear a lot of voices talking about whether we want to do something more in Syria or not, or whether we withdraw or not. I think this is a more of an abstract conversation to have, because there's a reality on the ground, and then the reality is that there's a mission underway. That mission has to be completed. We're not talking in June 2014, when there was a question whether to intervene in Syria or not. And at the time, you can probably argue, I can argue that probably that was a mistake, or the way it was conducted, it was a mistake to intervene in Syria in that way. But it has happened, and it has to be completed, and that's under the terms of the reality on the ground. And then you have obviously Western Syria. Why do I think about it in kind of quadrants? Because I think observers and politicians have spent so much time, probably most of the Syrian conflict history, talking about what to do, whether to remove Assad or not to remove Assad. And that binary was a flawed binary from the get-go. I think, especially in the latter years, in 2013 and 14, and after that, when the reality started to look different. And one thing I propose is basically to think of the solution in Syria as based on this division, a divide in Syria, basically. It's not divide in Syria in the sense of partition and kind of creating that sustainable division in Syria, but basically one phrase I use is divide to unify. So divide Syria, look at it as 4 separate regions, rather than think about whether to remove Assad or not. Now that's a separate conversation. I think the foreign countries and advocates of change in Syria have to focus on whether Bashar Assad has a future or not, but has to do it through Geneva, through other means. but not to miss the other opportunities that exist in Syria today. And I think still people are not catching up with this reality that we have different realities in Syria, and you can do so much meaningful stuff in Syria based on where like how Turkey conducts the operation in northern Syria, how Israel conducts the operations or campaign in northwestern Syria, southwestern Syria, how the U.S. does things in eastern Syria, and how Russia does things in western Syria. And if you can have that conversation and kind of deal with the kind of bottom-up work and do work in that way, rather than obsess about what happens in Geneva or what happens on the level of removing or not removing Bashar Assad. Although again, I stress you don't ignore that. You don't ignore that because I think it's still important. The question of Assad is still important and will continue to be important. But don't waste your time focusing on that. Just that. I think there are much more important things happening in eastern Syria. I think the United States and other countries are kind of thinking about it in the right way for now. I think there is a window of opportunity where the Syrian Democratic Forces in eastern Syria have popular goodwill. There are flaws, there are problems. I think the whole project is flawed from the get-go. But for now, under the current circumstances where ISIS has been defeated and there's a momentous kind of momentum against ISIS on a territorial level, I think that is an opportunity because people want to move away from the destruction that has happened over the past 3 years. There's so much destruction that has happened in the areas, and if countries start to think about how to get this area back on its feet, I think there's a big opportunity there. Like I said, you can defeat not just ISIS but also Al-Qaeda at the same time and keep them defeated. Elsewhere in the northwest, I think there's a lot of interesting things happening, but I leave it to Ziya to talk about that area. And one final thing to say is that it's important not to be deceived by how things are looking in Syria today. I think the situation is much more precarious and fragile than people make it to seem. You remember in December, I remember the the consensus in media was Assad is winning, and Russia has basically made that reality possible. The kind of Assad has won, and they have defeated ISIS, and you started to see a lot of revisionism about where people got things wrong based on that noise in Moscow and elsewhere. And that was almost, that looked like a reality. Pieces were falling into place. Russia was, working closely with Turkey to, like I said, redraw the military and political map in Syria. So things looked very tidy. Now, especially with starting from January onwards until now, the situation started to unravel. So you started to see something nobody expected, which is the Turkish campaign in the north, as Ziya will also talk about, and the increased campaign or attacks by Israel against Shia Iranian-backed militias, militia targets in central and southern Syria. And also you have, I think there's a surge in interest and relevance for ISIS that we haven't seen probably a month, or we didn't see 2-3 months ago, when people thought the campaign against ISIS will end with Mosul and Raqqa, and people now realize that that's not really the case, that something else is happening. There's more, this problem is a long-term thing. So I'll end it there, and we'll continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hassan, and I appreciate you dropping a lot of tricky topics to me and saying Ziya will explain that. Thank you, great. Exactly. So first of all, these are all my personal views, so I'm not representing any institution, whether British Army or our Center for Historical Analysis and Conflict Research, and I'm only using information that is available in public domain, so I'm not really drawing from any privileged perspective. Just a couple of points. I don't think the Afrin operation was a surprise to anybody who has actually observed Turkish policies, Turkish defense and security, professionally or even amateurishly, but interestedly. And again, this has really nothing to do about the person of Erdogan. So any analysis or language that boils it down to Erdoganology or Ottomans is really not going to help you from an analytic perspective. Again, we warned about this. pretty much 7-8 months prior to the Afrin operation, that Turkey was actually gearing towards the assert itself, and here were the explanations and the build-up. And none of this was actually a surprise. And at the moment, obviously, Turkey has a pretty much a multiple kind of layered approach to what it's doing in northeast Syria. The most obvious one is obviously deny PKK-related militant groups under whatever acronym or under whatever structure a territorial control. And if you look at any counterinsurgency doctrine, even that of British military or the US military, denial of an area to an insurgency you're fighting is actually a fundamental aspect of that. So the fact that Turkey has 911 kilometers long border with Syria, and substantial part of it would now be controlled by a militant group that it's fighting against, was obviously set for a conflict building up as a technocratic plate, if you like, on an earthquake. That was inevitable. The question of when it was up for debate, and whether or not how much US could actually prolong that before it achieves its aim, which was defeat of ISIS. And since Obama policy, and again, Trump has pretty much carried the policy that was already set in structure, the policy has been, look, here are the people who can fight against ISIS. They're not a threat against the United States. We can work with them. They're really effective. Turks will have to accept it as a tactical necessity, but we'll give some guarantees. And that was pretty much the DC's approach to it. And Turks actually bit that bitter pill, if you like, for a very long time, till it reached a point where the conversation coming from the DCA became really confusing for them. Who is actually they're going to listen to? Is it Trump? Is it Pentagon? Is it State Department? Is it the coalition representatives and spokesperson? Or is it the generals in the field doing the fight? And when the language of a border force that US will back on Turkey's borders, as well as a long-term US presence became clear, then Turkey saw an inevitable moment to assert itself, to deny PKK a territorial control over its borders. And secondly, and more than anything else, is actually gain a seat at the negotiating table on Syria. Syria has revealed that no matter how we see international relations and international law and diplomacy from a prism of institutions like UN Security Council or peace talks in Geneva, etc., in the end of the day, hard power has overridden a lot of diplomatic powers and mechanisms. In other words, if you're not in Syria, if you do not have a military presence from Ankara's perspective, you have no way of protecting your interests and asserting your interests in the discussions over the future of Syria. And since you host 3.5 million Syrians in your country, and since the fight in Syria is directly impacting your own domestic security, you have no option but to assert yourself in. And that's in international relations theory what is called offensive realism. A country sees anarchy and conflict in its borders and takes a hard approach to be able to assert its interests. Not Erdogan, not Ottomans. I know that's great for punditry, but it's a very rational actual state perspective on its borders and its border security. In the long term, however, Turkey faces all of the ills that comes with it. What is the actual long-term Turkish strategic ambition? Now, I have to be a bit gentle to Ankara towards that, the fact that it doesn't really have a clear-cut long-term idea of what it really wants in the long run in Syria, because nobody really has that. Neither Britain nor US nor the coalition. We're all pretty much making it as we go along and meeting the responses and trying to de-escalate what we see as a threat, depending upon who you are in this we. So I have to be a bit gentle towards Ankara on that, but it faces a serious security dilemma. While denying PKK a territory in North Syria makes sense, unless you have a political process within your country that can address the radicalization, people joining into PKK and PKK gaining domestic support, and while you're denying political space to Kurdish politics in Turkey, in the long run, you're basically bidding yourself for ongoing tensions. So Turkish military success in North Syria, as necessary as it might be, to deny an insurgency group a space, unless it's backed up by a long-term strategic thinking on how to handle its own domestic Kurdish questions, is bound to fail. It's bound to create new insecurities and vulnerabilities for Turkey. But at the moment, not only just because of presidential elections, but because of the actual experience of how much Ankara sees itself as investing into the last peace talks that collapsed in 2014-15, there is no intention at all for a new peace talk as we have seen happening. So again, nothing will change after the presidential elections in this year or next year. You will not really see a return to what we have seen in 2013-14. At the moment, the fight in Afrin and in that area is existential, both for Turkey and both for PKK. It's existential because whoever wins over that battle, whoever actually achieves the military upper hand, is going to dictate the terms of whatever next phase might be in that conversation, because it's not going to be a civilian-driven peace talk and political process like we have seen. It will be probably an indirect intelligence engagement, a ceasefire, and negotiation over what is tolerable, what is not tolerable in terms of what both parties can do for operations and responses. If you stand back from that, in Turkish military presence in Syria, then obviously there are the new outposts in the Idlib area. I think it's now 7 as part of the agreement with Russia and Iran. And again, that's them getting a compromise from Turkey. That's not necessarily in Turkey's strategic interest to handle areas like Idlib and that are really complex in regards to how do you handle all of these Sunni groups that are very tricky for Turkey itself to do, let alone for overall future of Syria. But ultimately, my humble reading of that is this is a compromise they had to give to Russia and to the Assad regime, one way or another. And again, their interests are quite clear on where they are shifting the fight and how they use these de-escalation zones for their own overall military tactics. And obviously, Turkey has no option but to work with Russia. It could not have done what it has done in Afrin without Russian airspace permission, which is also really telling that actually it wasn't the US that Turkey needed to permission to be able to do this. It was actually Russia. So by virtue of its geopolitical realities and military context of the battle, Turkey is stuck in having no option but to work with Russia on a give or take basis. Turkey is stuck with having no option but to work with Iran on a give and take basis. And at the moment, Ankara's priority, in fact, for the last 2.5 years, it hasn't been Assad. And there are clear statements that coming from everywhere you look at it, that even though sometimes there are harsh rhetorics towards him, the main priority of Turkey at the moment is to deny PKK, an area that it governs, work towards returning of perhaps half, if not a bit less or more, refugees that are in the country back to where they come from, and ultimately reap benefits of the long-term reconstruction of Syria. Because financially and economically, Turkey actually stands to win alone from the next phase, if you like, post-conflict aspect of what happens next in Syria. Obviously, Turkish-US relations are really fundamental within this, not because actually US is a game setter in Syria. It's not. I mean, I think Iran is the main game setter, and then Russia, and then Turkey, and then US. But at the same time, the overall context of what might happen between Turkey and US is worrying, not because Ankara or DC have a desire to see an actual fight or a complete collapse of relations. In fact, that's why Secretary Tillerson was in Ankara, and he exercised great listening more than anything else. He apparently listened. So the talks have begun in DC today and tomorrow. So 3 different working groups, Americans and Turks, are discussing different aspects of how this relationship got strained. It's not going to be solved, by the way, because US has not changed this policy. So Ankara also sees this as a time-winning tactic by the US to kind of, again, appease the Turks for a while the operations continue. But now that the YPG militants are pulling out from the SDF fight in South, coming up to fight in Afrin against Turkey, I think Americans are actually realizing how unsustainable the policy has been, how this was inevitable, the deadlock that they found themselves in. But I think overall, Turkey is walking a really difficult tightrope walk. Its relations are strained, obviously, with EU and with so many important countries, including Germany, in it. Its relations are really at a historic fragile point with the United States for so many reasons, not just because of Syria, but dominantly. And all of its regional partners are actually frenemies. So both Iran and Russia are strategic competitors for Turkey. So there is no direction Turkey turns to. So whenever someone writes an article saying, is Turkey turning away from the west to the east, a tree falls in a forest somewhere. Because actually there's no direction Turkey can turn to, and it's trapped into this very difficult position of trying to follow an independent policy, seeking its interests, but it's completely undermined by its own domestic politics, the direction of its own democratic and human rights standards and parliamentary standards, and its own political failures. So I think over the next 2 years, we'll see much more reactive and much more ad hoc Turkey asserting itself militarily, opening bases in a lot of strategic posts in Middle East and Africa as part of the same driving factor, which is offensive realism. It cannot remain absent from the way the things unfold in its border. I'll just end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, now we will head to the Q&A session. I have the advantage of having these 2 gentlemen on WhatsApp, so I can speak to them whenever I want, but you can't. So I am not going to abuse my chairman's privilege, and I'm going to open it straight to the floor so we can have as many questions from you guys as possible. May I remind you that this bit will be off the record, please. So anyone recording, please don't, and anything from this point on is their thoughts alone and not to be attributed outside of the Institute. So hands up, please. David.